In 2008, Dave in Adair County, Kentucky, had one of the creepiest, most frightening encounters we've read about in a while. After hearing reports of sounds in an unusual print on a farm near Green River Lake, Dave decided to investigate an area where a woman reportedly spotted a Bigfoot entering the side of the road. And this is what he saw as soon as he stepped out of his car. The area she reported the Bigfoot entering on the right side of the road corresponded to a graveled pull-off that had been there for decades and was used to access the lakeshore by people fishing. It had also become something of an unsightly and smelly dump for trash, brush, and tree limbs/deadfall all along its length and into the wooded bluff that leads down to the shore. When I stepped out of the car the first time, I realized I was walking on what was more or less a bone bed. There was quite a bit of small animal bones spread throughout the area, mixed with larger remains of deer that mostly looked like either roadkill, partial hunt kills, or taxidermy remnants, stripped deer skeletons without heads, that had been tossed over the edge of the bluff. With all of these remains lying around, and with a very direct path to the lakefront there as well, I pretty quickly understood why an animal might eagerly enter the dump, probably on a regular basis, to get easy meals and then make its way back across the road. Dave left the place and returned to the area the following month, and that's when things got creepy as hell. I arrived back at the sighting area at about 7:30 a.m. the next day after waking up to what seemed to be the foggiest morning in Adair County history. The lake itself was socked in and not visible at all from the bluff and trail. There was a heavy fog and condensation all throughout the area. My intention was just to head down the path and quickly collect the cam from the tree and return to the farm to join the rest of my family for the day's activities. I left the car unlocked and ready to depart. I retrieved the camera and noted that it had been tripped 3 or 4 times. I was anxious to get a look at any pics, so I headed straight back to the bluff, when I heard something pacing me in a large gully about 40 feet to the left. I wasn't concerned, as I'd never encountered anything there in any previous visits. I also began to dimly hear a nearby conversation between at least 2 men, who I believe were on a boat on the lake, possibly making their way under the bridge. I stopped about halfway up the trail, and the noises of movement briefly did as well. They seemed to move off further towards the left, in the direction of the voices I had heard. I got to the top of the turnaround and didn't hear any more movement, so I began to put the camera away in the back of the car, a Honda Element with a rear hatch. When I stepped back to shut the hatch, I noticed a strong smell that reminded me of a wet dog. But when I stepped back towards the car, just a foot or so, it was hardly detectable. There was a breeze coming from my right at this point, and when I stepped back again and shut the rear gate, I turned to the right and saw a figure immediately stand straight up about 80 feet away, in the tree line by the bridge. At first, it seemed like a wide-shouldered hulking figure without a head, but then I noticed a darker area between the shoulders, and realized that it was a face, either being held low in some kind of peering or aggressive stance. In retrospect, I now believe it heard the rear hatch slam, and possibly thought it was the car door and that I might have been ready to pull away and leave. It just stood stock still for a few moments, but then it began to sway from side to side a bit, and seemed to be lowering up and down, still very intently peering at me. I got the impression that whatever I was looking at was an old individual, because of the way it was acting, the odd posture, and the coloration I was beginning to make out. It was gray in the chest, almost running to white at the center line up the neck, kind of honey brown, reddish along the arms and body, with very wide shoulders and massive arms that hung low. I heard another bit of conversation drift up from the lake, and some laughter. Then this creature cut loose with a very loud bellow that I can only compare to an angry bull, and started to move in my direction. I then detected a much stronger odor that smelled like a rotting meat, and that really ramped up my anxiety level, so I decided to get in the car. When I turned to walk around to the driver's side, a burst of very low bass language of sorts came from the thing that sounded very much like scolding, and that's exactly how I felt, like I was trespassing and in big trouble. The combination of the yelling, the odor, and adrenaline was disorienting for a few moments, and I felt the strong and nonsensical urge to just sit down or lie down on the ground on the driver's side of the car, in the way a prey animal might react. I didn't obey that impulse, and instead climbed into the car and looked back towards the thing. I saw it hadn't changed position since I had gone out of its field of view, behind the car. It still seemed to be peering intently, and so I started the car. I normally carry a pistol in the field, and the coyote and now black bear are moving into that region big time. But I didn't have it belted on that morning. It was on the passenger car seat, so I unholstered it and watched out the passenger window, which was halfway down. And the creature made another loud grunt, and they began coming towards the car and the edge of the guardrail that runs across the bridge. I admit I was in a state of panic, so I pointed the gun, a Taurus concealed carry, out the window and towards the ground and fired 2 shots. The irrational part of me just wanted what was now clearly visible as a large bipedal hairy creature to stop coming towards me, and the rational part thought that if I fired shots and it behaved like an animal, it would bolt, and if it were somehow a human being, it would either yell something like "don't shoot" or take off as well. Its reaction to the shots was neither. It just stopped in its tracks, now 30 feet away, and stared. I did the only sensible thing I can recall that morning by fixing it in my view, then noting where it was in relation to the guardrail and below the top of my side window. I decided to get the fuck out of there. Unfortunately, it didn't even register to me that I was still holding the pistol, and when I went to shift down into drive, I inadvertently squeezed off another round right into the center console of the car. And that's a very loud event inside a Honda Element, which is basically a big metal box. I left the scene at high speed, nearly deaf from the sound of the gunshot. It was apparent that the car was damaged, since I couldn't get the windows to respond, and when I arrived back at the farm, I pulled the damaged console aside, and the wiring harness just fell apart. I spent the rest of that morning arranging for a car hauler to pick up the vehicle, and trying to relate what happened to my family. They attended the reunions, and I returned to Louisville with the car. There have been subsequent events at this location, which has now been cleaned up, fenced, and posted heavily with no dumping signs, but no direct sightings. The investigation still continues. This is my description of the creature with detail. Approximately 7.5 feet in height, with massive shoulders, maybe 3.5 feet across, and arms, but a trim-looking abdomen. The size was determined by visiting the location a couple of weeks later with others, and using an extending paint pole to measure from where I was parked to the place I fixed its position. The hair on the chest area was gray, running to an almost white coloration at the center line and neck. Gray hair around a black, gorilla-color face. No distinct features were clearly visible, except for a larger, flattened, almost human-type nose. There seemed to be a crease running down the center, but it was definitely not an ape nose. I saw no teeth, but a darker mouth area that moved and sometimes made an O shape when it vocalized. Dark eyes with no color that I could note. The head was rounded and non-conical, and it seemed like the hair was possibly thinner on top, like it was slightly balding. I could see a slight reflection on top, maybe from dark scalp showing through, and no ears were visible. As far as I know, I had an actual encounter with a Bigfoot.
I would like to tell you something about where I grew up in northern Oklahoma on a farm in the 60s and 70s. The location is somewhere west of Interstate 135, in the northernmost part of Oklahoma. It was a very wooded area. My uncle, who had lived in the area all his life, told a story about how when he was 8 or 10 years old, he was going out to the outhouse one cold winter night. They didn't have indoor plumbing in the house yet, and said that he tried to open the outhouse door. There was something inside it though, preventing it from opening. My uncle said he was sleepy and cold, and just wanted to do his business and be done with it, and get back into the warm house. So he pushed his way into the outhouse with a bit of force. He was suddenly confronted by running right into a huge, stinking, hairy creature. He first told me about this story before I was aware of Bigfoot, and I don't think he was ever aware of such things. I don't recall the Patterson footage being general knowledge around there at that time, and I was just curious about all things weird and wonderful and read up on the paranormal as often as I could. Anyway, what he described back then, now today, seems like a very average description of a Bigfoot creature. He said he just bumbled face first right into this wall of stinking fur. It smelled like dead pig, he said, and he was in the mostly dark outhouse not knowing what was going on. And when he looked up, he saw this huge, wide-eyed monster face staring back at him. My uncle let out a terrified scream, as you naturally would being a kid in such circumstances, and said that this thing screamed back at him at the same time, seemingly equally frightened, and then shoved him out of the way onto the ground and stepped over him, and started running away across to a nearby pig pen, towards the woods and into the river beyond. My uncle says that he sat there on his butt on the ground screaming in fear, and watching this big ape-like thing running away. It was a sort of comedy story when you envision a little kid and a Bigfoot frightening the bejesus out of each other in an outhouse. And I always loved the story and sometimes asked my uncle to tell it again because he animated it so much when he did. He says he ran back into the house screaming about monsters and woke everybody up. My grandmother would confirm this with a grin when she was still alive, and the whole family remembered the incident well. My uncle absolutely swore this was a true story, and years later, after learning about Bigfoot, it gave the story more validity to me. My uncle died many years ago, but his wonderful horror comic story is still fresh in my mind because of the way he told it, with wide eyes and an excited voice, even when he was an adult, and his absolute insistence that the story was true. Some years later, I had 2 Bigfoot encounters myself near there, but I won't go into that here, as this is getting a bit long, but I will tell you the rest of them another time.
My grandfather owns a farm about 30 miles north of Scranton, Pennsylvania. My grandparents owned many dogs throughout their lives, and my grandfather would often tell hunting stories about deers or bears that he'd hunt, and bring his most favorite dogs along. The story I'm about to tell has to do with a hunting dog in training named Joe. This story was even published once in a local magazine around Halloween, but the author got a lot of the details wrong, so I'm here to set the record straight. Joe was a German Shepherd that my grandfather was trying to train to be a hunter, but he was too wild at times. He would often tear after the prey before my grandfather gave the okay, and would ignore being called back. This all changed one night, however. It was a damp and bitter November night around 1972. My grandfather was hunting deer late into the evening and had brought Joe and his other dog Samson along. They were deep into a pine wood when Samson began whimpering and cowering. My grandfather noticed this strange behavior, but Joe seemed fine, so they continued on. About 5 minutes later, a putrid stench seemed to fill the air. He described it as human waste, a rotting carcass, and garbage all rolled into one. That's when Joe began to react. He flattened back his ears and growled at something back in the darkness. Samson, too, began to growl. My grandfather had his spotlight with him, and he shined it in the direction the dogs were barking. The next thing he saw gave him the chills. 2 gleaming red eyes reflected back at him from an enormous shadow about 40 yards away. He recalled the shadow being at least 8 feet tall, and he was certain that whatever this beast was, It was what was giving off the horrible odor. My grandfather immediately grabbed hold of Samson's collar, but he wasn't quick enough to grab Joe's, and Joe tore off after the creature. The beast backed away and retreated into the blackness, seemingly unalarmed. Fearful for Joe's safety, my grandfather strained his ears. He listened to Joe's barks and howls for some time, when they began to fade, and my grandfather turned to leave. He feared the worst, but he didn't want to be in those creepy woods with a strange creature he didn't know on the loose. When he arrived home, he told the family what had happened with Joe and the creature. Although he thought it was a crazy story, with his family's urges, he made a report about the creature to the police. The next day, they were in for a shock when his son, Paul, came home carrying Joe in his arms. He had found Joe on the side of the road when he was driving into town. He'd thought Joe was dead at first, since he was just lying there. But he wasn't. He was just extremely frightened. Joe continued to cower and walk around with his tail between his legs, fearful of everything and anything. The family was stumped. What kind of creature could possibly scare a youthful and hyperactive young dog to the point of which it was terrified of everything? In relation to this, apparently my grandfather wasn't the only one to witness this creature. 9 other reports were made to the police about it in our area. It's possible he may have encountered a Bigfoot.
In the fall of 1974, I was living in Oregon and I had decided to go backpacking on the Pacific Crest Trail south of Mount Hood. I parked my car at the trailhead and made a campsite at Frog Lake some miles south to spend the night. It was late afternoon when I got started, and dusk approached. I was uncertain as to how far from the lake I was. The trail was wide, but thick forest grew on either side as the trail was cut into the mountainside. Some time passed, and suddenly I thought I heard voices and wood being broken for a fire. I stopped and identified the sounds as coming from down the slope to the side of the trail in thick forest. I listened again, and it sounded like 2 or 3 people were talking, but in the thick forest it was hard to make out what they were saying. So I suddenly shouted, "Hey, down there, how far is it to the lake?" All of a sudden there was dead silence. A couple of minutes passed in the fading light, then the sound started up again. The voices were talking, but this time I listened more closely, trying to understand them. I couldn't. The voices sounded like muttering, punctuated with sibilant kind of sounds, not hissing, more S kind of consonant sounds. It was also very fast speech, sounding remotely like New Guinean mountain people. More unnerving though, was the pitch of the voices. It was low, in fact, at the very low register of the human voice, which told me these were very large individuals. Of course, I was charged with the realization that these individuals are not in fact humans, but more likely Bigfoot people. The wood sounds came back again, but whereas I first thought they were sounds of wood being broken for a fire, these sounds were more like shearing, tearing of wood. In other words, branches being stripped off a tree. Have you ever tried to strip a small branch from a tree barehanded? Well, not only were sizable branches being ripped from a tree, but the sound being made travelled all the way to my ears from the depths of the dark, thick forest. These were powerful beings, and it made my blood run cold to think of how big they must have been. With all the speed I could muster while carrying a 50-pound backpack, I moved my butt down the trail as fast as I could. I would look back every few yards in the now dim light to see if a massive, shadowy figure was headed in my direction. Fortunately, there wasn't.
What's up, guys? Blue Spooky here, as always. I just wanted to thank you guys for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. In this episode, I'd like to thank my special co-narrator, ThatCreepyPastaGuy. Since my throat is still a tiny bit hoarse, we're going to be having a few collaborations in the True Scary Story department. I've got a couple coming up with Let's Read, Insomniac, Unit 522, and Eden Studio, so keep a lookout for some of those when they come out. I'll probably announce those in the next couple of videos. If you guys enjoyed the video, please feel free to leave a comment below, or perhaps like, share, or subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have a personal story you'd like to send in, any story-themed suggestions, or a particular story you'd like to see, whether it be real or fictional, such as a creepypasta, all links to my social media will be in the description below. That is my Twitter, Gmail, and Facebook accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to take a look at your suggestion or story as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please feel free to include in the tagline of your message what the story is about, the theme it has if it has any, and how you would like to be credited in the description of the video the story appears in. As always, if you guys are curious about the music used in this episode, the music is always listed in the description in the order which it appears, and I'll have links to the artists as well, so you can go ahead and check down there if you're curious about the music. If you guys have any constructive criticism, please feel free to let me know, as I'm always looking for new ways to improve the channel. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.